15 seconds into that Christmas week, and I already knew something was wrong. Not because of the cold on my windshield or the early shift waiting for me, but because of the look my 9-year-old son gave me at breakfast. A look that said, "Please do not leave me here." A look no father ever wants to see. I remember that morning clearly. The house smelled like coffee and toast and the faint cinnamon scent Emily liked to spray around the kitchen this time of year. She stood at the counter checking her phone while Liam sat at the table tracing circles on the wood with one finger. He used to kick his feet, hum little tunes, ask me a dozen questions before I finished a cup of coffee. Lately he moved like someone was watching him, someone he did not want to disappoint or provoke. He glanced up only when I said his name. "Hey buddy, you ready for school?" His shoulders twitched just a little before he nodded. He kept his voice low. "Yes, Dad." Then he looked at Emily as if checking whether he had answered correctly. That small detail froze me more than the frost outside. Liam never checked with anyone before answering me. I poured coffee, sat down across from him, and asked the harmless questions parents ask without thinking. "How are classes? Anyone giving you a hard time?" "All normal stuff." He said everything was fine. Nothing happened. No one was bothering him. But he would not meet my eyes, and his voice had that careful tone I had only heard in the emergency room, from patients who were trying not to say too much with their families present. Emily finally turned toward us with that bright clipped cheerfulness she used when she wanted to end a conversation without looking controlling. "We really should get going," she said. "My parents want us early tonight. We are doing cookie baking and the whole big family thing." She looked at me. "They cannot wait to see Liam. You know how they are." Yes, I knew exactly how they were. Loud, opinionated, obsessed with old-fashioned values. People who believed that toughness was the only measure of character, and that gentleness was a flaw. I had always known they had strong personalities. I just never believed those personalities could become something darker. Liam gave the smallest flinch at the mention of the Calder house. Not enough for Emily to notice. Enough for me to feel my stomach tighten. I leaned closer to him, pretending to adjust the strap on his backpack, and whispered, "You good, kiddo?" He whispered back with a breathy little yes, but his eyes said no. 2 days earlier, Nancy Bergstrom, my colleague and friend, had stopped me in the hallway at Seattle General. She had asked casually, "When was Liam last at your in-law's place?" I told her he went almost every weekend. Her expression tightened. She told me she had seen faint bruises shaped like fingers on his arms during a routine checkup. Emily said he fell while running with his cousins. Nancy did not believe it, and she wanted me to know. I had tucked that detail away, trying to reason with myself that maybe he did fall. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Then I watched him that morning shrinking a little every time Emily spoke, and the bruise story suddenly felt very real. I drove Liam to school while Emily followed us in her car. She said she needed to pick up things for her parents before the big Christmas gathering. Liam was quiet the whole ride. Halfway there, he finally spoke. "Dad?" His voice trembled in a way he tried to hide. "Do you have to go to Denver tomorrow?" I had almost forgotten how small his voice could sound. I said, "The hospital wants me to present at the trauma conference. I will be gone only one night." Then I asked him why. He looked out the window. "No reason. Just asking." I pressed gently. "You know you can tell me anything." He nodded but did not speak again. After dropping him off, I sat in the parking lot longer than I should have. Something was wrong. Really wrong. But Emily brushed every concern aside. She accused me of being paranoid. She said Liam was sensitive and needed exposure to her side of the family to toughen up. She said kids bump into things all the time, and maybe because I was always tired or because I wanted to avoid a fight, I let her explanation stand. That morning, though, his eyes told a different story. Later that afternoon, when I came home between shifts, Emily was stuffing clothes into bags for her parents' house. She moved quickly, avoiding conversation. When I asked if Liam seemed okay, she rolled her eyes. "He is fine, Mark. You worry too much. My family loves him. You make it sound like they are monsters." I told her Nancy had seen bruises. Emily froze for half a second, then forced a laugh. "For heaven's sake, they roughhouse. He probably bumped into the table. There's nothing wrong. You are blowing this up because you work around trauma all day. Not everything is a case." She zipped the bag sharply like she was ending the discussion. But that tiny freeze did not slip past me. I should have pushed harder. I should have followed my instinct. But I had a flight to catch the next morning. And Emily made it sound like this was my guilt talking, not reality. So I backed off. The next day, at dawn, I left for the airport. Liam hugged me at the door tighter than usual. His fingers dug into my jacket. "Dad," he whispered, his voice shaking more than he wanted me to hear. "Do not let me stay there too long. Please." I knelt down. "Hey, what does that mean? Are you scared of something?" He shook his head quickly. "No. I just want you home soon." He tried to smile, but it broke halfway. I promised him I would call him that night. He nodded but did not let go until Emily said his name sharply from the stairs. On the plane to Denver, I kept replaying his face. Eyes wide, afraid, asking me not to leave him there. All day during the conference, I checked my phone every hour. I called during lunch, but Emily answered quickly, saying they were busy baking cookies and could not talk. When I asked to see Liam, she turned the camera away and said he was with the cousins. I heard laughter in the background, but not the warm kind. Sharp, mocking laughter. By the time evening hit, I could not focus on my presentation notes. My gut told me something was off. Something was wrong behind that perfect holiday facade Emily insisted on. I tried to shake it off. Tried to tell myself I was tired and projecting. Then at 8:30, my phone buzzed with a message from Jack Monroe. His text said, "Call me now. It is about your boy." My throat closed. I called immediately. Jack sounded shaken, which was rare for a man built like a wall and retired from the military. "Mark," he said, "I do not know how to tell you this. I heard yelling outside. I thought maybe it was a dog or something. But I checked. It was Liam. In your yard. And the whole Calder family. I filmed it. You need to see it." He sent the video. My hand was already shaking before I pressed play. I watched 15 seconds. That was all it took for my stomach to turn into a stone. Liam soaked in freezing rain. A ring of adults around him. Calm, almost amused. A hand coming forward. A slap. His head snapping to the side, and the faint sound of someone laughing like it was a joke. That was the moment everything changed. I booked the first flight home without thinking. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the hotel into the cold night, trying to breathe. My son was in danger, real danger, and I had left him there. On the way to the airport, my phone buzzed again. Jack had called the police, but Emily convinced them it was a misunderstanding. The entire family backed her story. They always closed ranks, always protected each other. I felt anger rising inside me in a way I had never felt in the operating room, even during the worst trauma cases. I knew I could not face this alone. So I scrolled through old contacts until I found a name I had not touched in 8 years. Daniel Cho. I pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "Mark," he said. "Been a long time. What is going on?" I took a breath and said, "My son? They hurt my son." Then I told him everything. The plane boarded as I finished. The last thing Daniel said before I switched my phone to airplane mode was simple and steady. "Come home. We start tomorrow." I sat down in my seat, staring at the darkness outside the small oval window. I had no idea what I would find when I got back to Seattle. I only knew one thing. Whatever happened next would not be quiet, and it would not be gentle. And for the first time in my life, I hoped it would not be. I kept my eyes on the runway lights as the plane lifted into the air, the engines shaking through the seat and into my chest. My mind was already back in Seattle, running ahead of me, trying to reach Liam before anything else could happen to him. I did not sleep. I did not even blink long enough to pretend I had rested. I just sat there replaying those 15 seconds of video while the darkness outside pressed against the window like it wanted to see what kind of father could leave his son behind. The flight landed before dawn. I grabbed my bag and moved through the airport without feeling the cold or the noise around me. I made it to the curb just as a familiar black sedan pulled in. The rear window slid down, and Daniel Cho nodded from the back seat. He looked older than I remembered, a little more gray at the temples. Same sharp eyes. "Get in, Mark. We have a lot to do." I climbed in beside him. The heater blasted against my frozen face, but it did nothing for the cold in my chest. "You saw the video, Daniel," I said. "I did." His jaw tightened. "It is worse than anything I expected, and I expected bad." He opened a folder filled with printed frames from the video. Every single image showed Liam caught in some impossible moment between fear and obedience. Faces around him, half smiling, half calculating. Adults treating a child like an object they owned. I asked if I was crazy. If there was any world where this could be explained as discipline. Daniel shook his head before I even finished. "No, Mark. This is abuse. Coordinated. Repeated." Those people were calm. That only happens when it is not the first time. The sedan pulled onto the highway toward downtown Seattle. I watched the sky turn from black to a washed-out gray. Traffic started to pick up with commuters who had no idea I was about to begin a fight that would either save my son or break me in the process. Daniel tapped the folder. "We need medical evidence that the bruises are consistent with repeated harm. Nancy is waiting at the hospital. She already prepared the documentation. We need cooperation from CPS. I have someone who might help us, and we need an investigator to gather everything your in-laws have been hiding." He reached forward and knocked twice on the dashboard. The driver raised a hand in greeting. When he spoke, I recognized Ethan Ward from years ago. He was a quiet man with a calm stare that did not miss much. "Good to see you again, Mark. I am sorry it is under these circumstances." I could not respond. My throat felt tight. Ethan passed a second folder back to me. "Open it. You need to know what we are dealing with." Inside were bank records showing transfers from Emily to her parents. $1,500 every month for 3 years. I stared at the numbers, wondering how I never noticed. Daniel watched me, waiting. "That money came from your joint savings," Ethan said. "It did not show on your primary statements because she routed it through her private account first." I felt a slow burn in my stomach. Why would she hide payments to her parents unless she knew I would not approve? What else had she been hiding about them? Ethan continued flipping pages. There were also CPS inquiries. 2 cases involving children in the extended Calder family. Both closed quickly. Suspiciously quickly. And your wife was the one who gave statements that supported closing them. The more I read, the more my hands shook. I had lived beside a web of lies without seeing the pattern. Daniel leaned closer. "There is one more thing." He handed me a printout. A voicemail transcription from someone named Anita Herrera. "She is a CPS worker," Daniel said. "She tried to flag a concern about your son last year. Your wife convinced her it was a misunderstanding. Anita says she felt pressured. She wants to help now." I stared at the seat in front of me. All these adults, all these people in positions of trust. And none of them had protected Liam. The only one who could have stopped this had been me, and I had failed. We pulled into Daniel's office building just after 7. Inside, Light spilled from a conference room where files were spread across the table. Daniel moved with crisp precision, laying out strategies one after another. We will file for immediate protective custody. We will show the judge the video. We will provide medical evidence. We will establish a pattern of abuse and concealment. We will request supervised visitation only, and we will have the police accompany us when we retrieve your son. The weight of those words settled through me. Retrieve your son, like he had been taken. And maybe in a way, he had. Suddenly my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Just 2 words. All good. Followed by a heart. I felt something twist inside me. The casualness of it. The lie of it. Daniel saw the message on my screen and let out a quiet breath. She is covering her tracks, he said, which means they are already preparing their version of events. That was when Ethan stepped in. He set his laptop in front of me and opened a new file. Surveillance images. A still frame of Melissa yelling at a teenage cashier. A record of Derek's complaint from a property dispute. A statement from someone at the Calder's church mentioning aggressive behavior from Hunter. Even Janet in a heated argument behind her bakery. This family has a history of intimidation, Ethan said. They hide it well. But it is there. He clicked on the last file. A faint audio recording of children playing, followed by a cry, and a woman's stern voice telling someone to stop being weak. It was not clear enough to use in court, but clear enough for me to know what kind of environment my son had been in. My head dropped into my hands. The air felt heavy. Daniel placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Mark, listen to me. You are doing the right thing. You came back. You are fighting for your son. That is what matters now. I nodded, but the guilt stayed. I thought of Liam standing in the cold rain, blinking through tears, surrounded by faces that should have protected him. How many times had that scene played out without a camera to witness it? We spent the next hour building the emergency petition. Every detail from the video, every bruise documented by Nancy, every prior CPS complaint, every financial transaction, every pattern of psychological harm. We organized it so the judge would see everything clearly, without room for interpretation. When we finished, Daniel checked the clock. It was almost 9. He looked at me. We file this now. Once the judge reviews it, we move. We will bring the police. CPS will accompany us. We will get your son out today. Those words hit me like cold water. Today. Not tonight. Not after Christmas. Today. I followed Daniel out of the office. The winter wind cut across my face as we walked to the car, but I barely felt it. Ethan was already in the driver's seat. Daniel slid into the back and motioned for me to follow. Before I climbed in, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and stared at the screen. No missed calls from Emily. No messages from Liam. Nothing. I whispered into the cold morning air without meaning to. Hold on, buddy. I am coming. Then I got into the car and closed the door behind me as the engine started, and we drove toward the courthouse. I kept my eyes on the runway lights as the plane lifted into the air, the engines shaking through the seat and into my chest. My mind was already back in Seattle, running ahead of me, trying to reach Liam before anything else could happen to him. I did not sleep. I did not even blink long enough to pretend I had rested. I just sat there, replaying those 15 seconds of video while the darkness outside pressed against the window, like it wanted to see what kind of father could leave his son behind. The flight landed before dawn. I grabbed my bag and moved through the airport without feeling the cold or the noise around me. I made it to the curb just as a familiar black sedan pulled in. The rear window slid down, and Daniel Cho nodded from the back seat. He looked older than I remembered, a little more gray at the temples. Same sharp eyes. Get in, Mark. We have a lot to do. I climbed in beside him. The heater blasted against my frozen face, but it did nothing for the cold in my chest. You saw the video, Daniel. I said. I did. His jaw tightened. It is worse than anything I expected, and I expected bad. He opened a folder filled with printed frames from the video. Every single image showed Liam caught in some impossible moment between fear and obedience. Faces around him, half smiling, half calculating. Adults treating a child like an object they owned. I asked if I was crazy, if there was any world where this could be explained as discipline. Daniel shook his head before I even finished. No, Mark. This is abuse. Coordinated, repeated. Those people were calm. That only happens when it is not the first time. The sedan pulled onto the highway toward downtown Seattle. I watched the sky turn from black to a washed-out gray. Traffic started to pick up with commuters who had no idea I was about to begin a fight that would either save my son or break me in the process. Daniel tapped the folder. We need medical evidence that the bruises are consistent with repeated harm. Nancy is waiting at the hospital. She already prepared the documentation. We need cooperation from CPS. I have someone who might help us. And we need an investigator to gather everything your in-laws have been hiding. He reached forward and knocked twice on the dashboard. The driver raised a hand in greeting. When he spoke, I recognized Ethan Ward from years ago. He was a quiet man with a calm stare that did not miss much. Good to see you again, Mark. I am sorry it is under these circumstances. I could not respond. My throat felt tight. Ethan passed a second folder back to me. Open it. You need to know what we are dealing with. Inside were bank records showing transfers from Emily to her parents. $1,500 every month for 3 years. I stared at the numbers, wondering how I never noticed. Daniel watched me, waiting. That money came from your joint savings, Ethan said. It did not show on your primary statements because she routed it through her private account first. I felt a slow burn in my stomach. Why would she hide payments to her parents unless she knew I would not approve? What else had she been hiding about them? Ethan continued flipping pages. There were also CPS inquiries. 2 cases involving children in the extended Calder family. Both closed quickly, suspiciously quickly, and your wife was the one who gave statements that supported closing them. The more I read, the more my hands shook. I had lived beside a web of lies without seeing the pattern. Daniel leaned closer. There is one more thing. He handed me a printout. A voicemail transcription from someone named Anita Herrera. She is a CPS worker, Daniel said. She tried to flag a concern about your son last year. Your wife convinced her it was a misunderstanding. Anita says she felt pressured. She wants to help now. I stared at the seat in front of me. All these adults, all these people in positions of trust, and none of them had protected Liam. The only one who could have stopped this had been me, and I had failed. We pulled into Daniel's office building just after 7. Inside, light spilled from a conference room where files were spread across the table. Daniel moved with crisp precision, laying out strategies one after another. We will file for immediate protective custody. We will show the judge the video. We will provide medical evidence. We will establish a pattern of abuse and concealment. We will request supervised visitation only. And we will have the police accompany us when we retrieve your son. The weight of those words settled through me. Retrieve your son, like he had been taken. And maybe in a way he had. Suddenly my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Just 2 words, all good. Followed by a heart. I felt something twist inside me. The casualness of it. The lie of it. Daniel saw the message on my screen and let out a quiet breath. She is covering her tracks, he said, which means they are already preparing their version of events. That was when Ethan stepped in. He set his laptop in front of me and opened a new file. Surveillance images. A still frame of Melissa yelling at a teenage cashier. A record of Derek's complaint from a property dispute. a statement from someone at the Calder's church mentioning aggressive behavior from Hunter. Even Janet in a heated argument behind her bakery. "This family has a history of intimidation," Ethan said. "They hide it well. But it is there." He clicked on the last file. A faint audio recording of children playing, followed by a cry, and a woman's stern voice telling someone to stop being weak. It was not clear enough to use in court, but clear enough for me to know what kind of environment my son had been in. My head dropped into my hands. The air felt heavy. Daniel placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Mark, listen to me. You are doing the right thing. You came back. You are fighting for your son. That is what matters now." I nodded, but the guilt stayed. I thought of Liam standing in the cold rain, blinking through tears, surrounded by faces that should have protected him. How many times had that scene played out without a camera to witness it? We spent the next hour building the emergency petition. Every detail from the video, every bruise documented by Nancy, every prior CPS complaint, every financial transaction, every pattern of psychological harm. We organized it so the judge would see everything clearly without room for interpretation. When we finished, Daniel checked the clock. It was almost 9. He looked at me. "We file this now. Once the judge reviews it, we move. We will bring the police. CPS will accompany us. We will get your son out today." Those words hit me like cold water. Today. Not tonight. Not after Christmas. Today. I followed Daniel out of the office. The winter wind cut across my face as we walked to the car, but I barely felt it. Ethan was already in the driver's seat. Daniel slid into the back and motioned for me to follow. Before I climbed in, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and stared at the screen. No missed calls from Emily. No messages from Liam. Nothing. I whispered into the cold morning air without meaning to. "Hold on, buddy. I am coming." Then I got into the car and closed the door behind me as the engine started, and we drove toward the courthouse. The courthouse parking lot was still half empty when we pulled in. The winter sun barely a pale smear over Seattle. I stepped out of the car, and the cold felt sharper than it should have. Like the morning itself was warning me there would be no easy victory here. Daniel walked fast, clutching the petition folder in one hand, his expression set in that calm, relentless focus he used when he knew time mattered. I followed him through the glass doors, past security, down the hallway that smelled like paper and old carpet and anxiety. Judge Brooks was already in her chambers. She had the reputation of ruling with precision and zero patience for anyone who wasted her time. When we entered, she looked at the folder as if it were any other case. But as soon as Daniel began speaking, her posture changed. He laid out each piece of evidence in order. The video stills, the bruising patterns, the CPS inquiries, the email about Luke bullying Liam that had been recalled, the bank transfers, the voicemail from Anita, the medical preparations Nancy had arranged. It was like watching someone place explosives under the foundation of a house, one brick at a time. I stayed silent through all of it. I knew if I opened my mouth too early, the wrong emotion might spill out. Anger, guilt, fear, none of that would help my son. The judge glanced at me once, just a flick of her eyes, enough to measure what kind of father stood in her courtroom. When Daniel finished, she pressed her lips together and nodded slowly. She signed the emergency order with a firm stroke of her pen. Then she looked directly at me. "Retrieve your son now." Those 4 words nearly took the strength out of my legs. I thanked her, but my voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. Daniel guided me out of chambers while talking to someone on the phone from CPS. Ethan was already coordinating with the police. Everything moved at a speed that made the world feel like it was tilting. We regrouped outside, the air colder than before. The patrol officers met us by their cruiser. Both knew the situation. Both had watched the video. One of them, Officer Ray, shook his head slowly. Never seen anything like that. We will handle the adults. You stay focused on your boy. I nodded, but my hands had started shaking again. Just like when I watched the video for the first time. The drive to the Calder house felt twice as long as it should have. Every minute fed a new worry. Was Liam scared? Was he still being punished? Was he somewhere alone? Every possible scenario ran through my head, each one worse than the last. Daniel must have sensed the thoughts piling up because he spoke without taking his eyes off the road. When we get there, stay behind the officers until they secure the area. Do not engage with anyone. Do not let Emily distract you. You go to Liam only when they tell you to. I told him I understood. But the truth was, I did not know what I would do when I saw Emily. It depended on what she did first. The thought left a heavy knot in my chest. We turned onto the Calder Street. A row of narrow two-story houses lined with icicle lights and inflated holiday decorations. Everything looked cheerful and harmless. It made the memory of that video feel even more violent. Their house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, the porch wrapped in garland, a wreath on the door as if nothing but holiday joy lived inside. The police cruiser stopped in front. I stepped out. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. Officer Ray and his partner approached the front door while the rest of us waited by the sidewalk. I could hear muffled voices inside. Then footsteps. The door swung open. Janet Calder stood there, gripping a dish towel, acting startled. She glanced past the officers and saw me. Her face hardened. She turned back to them and put on a tone of offended dignity. What is this about? We are in the middle of Christmas preparations. Her husband Robert came up behind her, jaw clenched. He crossed his arms and stared the officers down. I could see Emily at the end of the hallway, halfway behind the staircase. For a second I thought she might run. Instead, she walked forward, smoothing her sweater and forcing a smile so bright it almost looked painful. Mark, what are you doing here? Officer Ray stepped between us. We are here regarding the safety of minor child Liam Turner. We have a court order. He handed her a copy. Her smile cracked instantly. This is insane, she snapped. My husband is manipulating the system because he cannot control his temper. She said it calmly, like she had rehearsed it, like she already had her lies lined up one after another. Daniel stepped up next to me. We have a video of 7 adults physically striking a child. Save your explanations for court. Her face drained of color at that. She finally saw the line she could not cross. Bring Liam out, Officer Ray said. No one moved. I felt something shift in my chest. A pressure building. Something that might have exploded if not for Daniel's hand on my arm. Then soft footsteps padded across the hardwood and Liam appeared behind Emily. His hair was uncombed, his eyes red, his shoulders drawn in tight as if he were trying to fold himself smaller. The second he saw me, everything in his face broke open. He ran. Emily tried to grab his arm, but he jerked free and sprinted across the room. I dropped to my knees and caught him as he collapsed into me. Dad, please do not let me stay here. Please take me home. His voice cracked on the last word. I held him so tight I could feel his ribs shaking. Behind us, the officers separated the adults. Janet shouted about lies. Robert cursed at Daniel. Melissa threatened lawsuits. Hunter tried to film the scene, but Ethan stepped in front of him, blocking the camera, unbothered by the man's size or his anger. Liam clung to me like he thought someone might pull him away any second. I lifted him into my arms, even though he was getting older and heavier. I could feel how cold his skin was through his shirt. It is okay, buddy. I have you now. You are going with me. Emily took one step toward us, eyes wet, voice trembling like she wanted to sound hurt instead of guilty. Mark, we can talk about this. He does not understand what is happening. You are confusing him. Her words twisted something inside me. I looked at her and, for the first time, saw the truth behind every excuse she had given me. This was not about misunderstanding or discipline or tough love. This was about power, about control, about a family that hurt a child because they believed they had the right to. Daniel stepped forward. We are done here. The judge has granted full emergency custody to the father. Any attempt to interfere will be documented. Officer Ray motioned for me to head to the car. I held Liam close and walked past everyone without a word. Their voices faded into a blur. Liam's hands stayed locked around my neck the whole time. When we reached the car, he finally lifted his head. His eyes were swollen, his lashes wet. Am I really going home? Yes, buddy. You are coming with me. You are safe now. He pressed his forehead against my shoulder and whispered something I had to lean in to hear. I tried to be good, Dad. I did everything they said. My throat tightened. You never had to do anything for their approval. You never did anything wrong. He let out a shaky breath as if he had been holding it for weeks. We pulled away from the curb while the house shrank in the rear window. It felt like leaving a battlefield. I kept one arm around my son until his breathing steadied. We drove straight to the hospital. Nancy met us at a side entrance, her expression shifting from determination to heartbreak when she saw Liam's face pressed against my shirt. She led us into an exam room filled with soft lighting and blankets, the kind she used for especially fragile cases. Liam sat quietly while she examined his arms and back. She worked with the gentleness of someone who had seen too many children hurt by the people who were supposed to love them. When she finished, she looked at me with eyes that carried no doubt. This was not a one-time incident, Mark. These injuries are patterned. Some are older, some newer. There is no question. I put my hand on Liam's back, feeling the slight rise and fall of his breaths. He was exhausted, worn down, but safe. Daniel stood in the doorway, checking his watch. Everything goes into the report. Once we file this, the next step starts. I asked him what the next step was. He closed the file and said quietly, building the case that will take them all down. He meant it, and I felt myself believe him. Daniel's words hung in the doorway for a long moment, heavy enough to silence the air in the exam room. I looked down at Liam, who had curled against my side on the small hospital bench, his eyes half closed from exhaustion. I brushed a hand lightly over his hair, careful not to touch any tender spots on his scalp. He let out a soft sound that was part relief and part fear, the kind that makes a father want to build walls out of steel around his child. Nancy stepped out to process the medical findings, and Daniel motioned for me to follow him into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, too bright for the early afternoon. The hospital felt familiar, but today it felt like a battlefield I had walked onto without armor. We need to move quickly, Daniel said. The Calders will not sit quietly. They will try to twist this. They will lie. They will try to get ahead of us. I already know they will, I said, leaning against the wall. They have been lying for months. Daniel handed me his tablet. There is something you need to see before we finalize the next filing. On the screen was a series of emails Ethan had pulled from a cloud backup. Emily did not know synced automatically. The files had been recovered a few hours earlier. My heart beat faster as I scrolled. It was a conversation between Emily and her sister Melissa from 6 months ago. They discussed how to respond if Liam ever mentioned being hurt. They debated what explanations would sound plausible. They talked about keeping CPS out of their business. They used phrases that made my stomach knot. Make sure he knows not to accuse anyone. He needs to learn respect. He is too sensitive. Maybe some discipline will make a man out of him. Seeing Emily's words in writing made everything real, in a way the video alone had not. This was not impulsive. It was planned, discussed, coordinated. I felt my hands tremble and forced myself to breathe. Daniel watched me carefully. This shows premeditation. It is critical, but there is more. He opened another file. This one held a set of photos taken over the past year. Pictures I had never seen. Pictures of Liam with faint bruises on his arms, one on his shoulder, another across his back, some faded, some fresh, all hidden. These were stored under a locked folder on your home computer. Ethan broke the encryption. Someone had been keeping track. I stared at the images. My face grew hot. Every instinct I had as a father screamed at me that I should have known, should have seen, should have protected him. I swallowed hard. I did not trust my own voice, so I stayed silent. Daniel did not push. He turned the tablet off and tucked it into his bag. Mark, listen. You cannot change what you did not know. What matters now is what you do next. I nodded. Even though I was not sure, my body felt connected to my mind. A quiet knock behind us drew our attention. Anita Herrera stood there, her winter coat still buttoned to her throat, her expression tight and nervous. She looked younger than I remembered from her file. Mid-30s, tired eyes. The kind of tired that comes from working too many cases with too few people who care. Daniel introduced us, and she nodded once. I came as soon as I heard. She said, I should have pushed harder the first time. I knew something was wrong when your wife demanded that the file be closed. She said it was a misunderstanding and that your son was confused. I believed her. I should not have. Her voice cracked and she looked down. It takes a lot for a CPS worker to admit a mistake. Her honesty made my chest ache in a different way, not anger, something closer to grief. What matters is that you are here now, I said quietly. She looked up with a mix of shame and determination. I can testify about what happened. I also kept copies of the notes she wanted me to delete. They show a clear pattern of behavioral distress in your son. And I know how their family operates. This is not the first time they have done this to a child. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I opened it and felt my breath catch. It was another video. Shakier. Filmed from farther away. The Calder house decked in Christmas lights, adults moving around inside. And in the background, a voice I recognized. Robert Calder. Harsh. Hard. The tone of a man disciplining a child who had already learned fear. Daniel saw my expression and took the phone. His eyes narrowed. Where did this come from? A moment later, another text appeared. Heard what they did to that boy. Thought you should have this. No name, no number, just the clip. Ethan walked down the hall toward us, already talking. I traced the device that sent it. Looks like a neighbor in their cul-de-sac. Someone else saw abuse before. Someone afraid to go public, but willing to help you. Daniel rubbed his temple. This is bigger than we thought. I felt something shift inside me, a slow, controlled burn. They had done this for years, to others, not just my son. Children had been hurt and silenced, and Emily helped them cover it up. I will not let them get away with this, I said. My voice sounded low and steady, the same voice I used in the operating room when things went from bad to catastrophic. The voice that came only when I had no choice but to act. Outside the exam room, we heard footsteps. When I turned, Nancy was standing there. Her expression told me everything before she spoke. We need to talk. She guided us into a small consultation room. Liam stayed in the exam room, coloring quietly under the supervision of a nurse. I sat at the table with Daniel and Ethan, and Nancy set a file down in front of us. This is my official report. She said, it is not just the injuries from today. There are signs of injuries healing at different times. Weeks apart, months apart. Someone has been grabbing him hard enough to leave marks repeatedly. She looked directly at me, and he told me something during the exam. He said they sometimes made him stand outside at night if he cried. The words hit like a punch. I closed my eyes. Daniel leaned forward. Mark, this is exactly the pattern that shows repeated emotional and physical coercion. This strengthens your case. It did not make me feel better. It made me want justice more than anything I had ever wanted in my life. Nancy placed a hand on the file. There is no question. This is abuse. Documented. Repeated. Severe. I nodded slowly and exhaled through my teeth. What happens next? I asked. Not in a calm way. Not in a fearful way. In a way that meant I was ready to tear down every single wall needed to protect my son. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Next, we compile every piece of evidence. We file for a full custody petition. We request a criminal investigation. We identify every adult who touched your son. And then we expose everything they tried to hide. He paused and looked at me more deliberately. But first, you need to take Liam home. Let him rest. Let him know he is safe. We will work from here, Ethan added quietly. This is going to get ugly. They will fight back. They will smear you. They will use everything they have. I shrugged once, a small, sharp motion. Let them try. I stood, feeling the weight of what was coming settle in my bones. The fear I had felt earlier had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of a father who had failed. It was the resolve of one who would not fail again. I walked back into the exam room. Liam looked up from the coloring book, eyes searching for mine. When he saw me, he gave a small, exhausted smile. You ready to go home, buddy? I asked. He nodded and slid off the chair, slipping his hand into mine. We stepped out into the hallway, leaving the exam room behind. And something inside me clicked into place. Whatever came next, whatever fight waited outside those hospital doors, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done reacting. Now I would start acting. We walked out of the hospital into the cold afternoon air, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to clarity. Liam's hand was small in mine, cold but steady. And each step away from that building felt like one more inch between him and the people who had hurt him. Still, every instinct in me was wired tight. I kept glancing over my shoulder as if one of the Calders might suddenly appear. Daniel followed us to my car. He leaned in before I closed the door. Keep your phone on. I will call as soon as we have confirmation on the follow-up orders. They will try something. Do not underestimate that. I said I understood. And I did. They had already lied to police once. They had already fooled CPS once. They would not give up quietly. The drive home was quiet. Liam stared out the window, eyes half open, the kind of exhaustion you only see in children who have been scared for too long. I wanted to talk to him, comfort him, tell him everything was over. But I could not make myself lie. Not yet. When we pulled into our driveway, he hesitated before getting out, like he expected someone to yell at him for stepping onto solid ground. I knelt beside him and rested a hand on his back. You are safe here. This is your home. No one is going to touch you. He nodded, but did not speak. That was fine. Words were not going to fix anything today. Inside, I made him a sandwich. The same peanut butter and jelly he always asked for when he was younger. He took a few small bites and then pushed the plate back. I sat down with him on the couch, the living room quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. After a minute, he asked, Dad, can I tell you something if you don't get mad? I turned toward him, heart already bracing for whatever came next. He kept his eyes on his shoes. When Luke pushed me down the stairs last month, I told Mom and she said I was being dramatic. She told me not to embarrass the family, and Melissa laughed. She said boys needed to toughen up. I felt something sharp twist inside me. Anger, grief, guilt, all mixed into something heavy. I kept my voice level. You did nothing wrong. None of that was your fault. He nodded, but the words did not seem to reach him fully. Trauma does that. It carves messages too deep for a single sentence to erase. A soft knock at the door startled both of us. Liam froze. I moved quickly, stepping between him and the entryway. When I opened the door, Nancy stood there, holding a binder and a bag of medical supplies. I wanted to check on him again before I filed the official report. She said quietly, and I thought he might need something for the swelling. I led her inside. She smiled gently at Liam and asked if she could look at his arm again. He agreed without speaking. She examined him in the living room, speaking softly, reassuring him with every step. When she finished, she pulled me aside. He is physically stable, but emotionally, he is holding everything inside. He needs rest and safety. He needs to be with you. I nodded. I knew she was right. She touched my arm in that direct, caring way some doctors have. This will get worse before it gets better. But you are doing what a good father should do. Her words landed heavier than I expected. After she left, I set Liam up in his room with a blanket and one of his old stuffed animals he had not touched in months. He held it without comment and curled into bed. I stayed until he closed his eyes. Downstairs, my phone rang. Daniel again. We have the full order, he said. Emergency custody is granted. The restraining order against the Calder family is in effect. If they step foot near your home or your son, they will be arrested. I exhaled. But he did not pause. One more thing. Ethan found something else. I straightened. What now? There were 2 complaints filed at Liam's school this fall, both involving Luke. One of them described Luke pushing Liam to the ground and calling him weak. The teacher wrote a note recommending a parent meeting. Your wife had the record removed from the system. She told the school Liam was making it up to get attention. I closed my eyes and leaned against the counter. It felt like every hour revealed something worse. Daniel kept going. We also got confirmation that Emily contacted the school counselor to request Liam not be pulled from class for observation. She said it was unnecessary and disruptive. My voice came out low, so she knew. She saw what was happening and she protected them instead of him. Yes, Daniel said, and it will help your case. I hung up and just stood there for a moment, pressing my hands into the wooden countertop. The house felt too small, too quiet, like it had been built around a lie I had been living for years. I walked into the living room and stared at the framed photo on the wall. The 3 of us at Lake Crescent last summer. Emily's smile wide. Liam forced, mine oblivious. It looked different now, like a warning no one noticed. A sound came from upstairs. Soft crying. Not loud, not desperate. Just a small leak of pain from a boy who had held too much for too long. I went up quietly. Liam sat in bed with his knees drawn up, wiping his face with the back of his hand. When he saw me, he tried to stop crying immediately, like he expected to be scolded. I sat beside him and waited. He leaned against me and whispered, I did not tell you, because they said you would get mad. They said you would think I was weak. My chest tightened. I pulled him in gently. I will never be angry at you for needing help. Never. He nodded into my shirt, breathing unevenly. After a while, he fell asleep again. I went back downstairs and found Ethan waiting by my front porch. He must have come straight from Daniel's office. He handed me a flash drive and a folder. More financials, he said, and something else. Inside the folder was a list of phone calls between Emily and her mother. Frequent, long, strategically timed around every school incident involving Liam. And attached was a transcription of one call Anita had recovered from her system before it was deleted. Emily telling Janet that Liam needed tougher discipline. Janet agreeing. both of them laughing lightly as if they were discussing holiday plans. I felt something cold settle deeper inside me. Not rage exactly, but a quiet decision. Ethan watched my face. "You all right?" "No, but I will be." He nodded like he understood the meaning behind that, and stepped back. "Let me know if you need anything tonight. Daniel and I are both on standby." I said I would, and closed the door slowly. The house was dim, lit only by the living room lamp. The weight of everything we had uncovered felt like it sat on my shoulders. Every lie, every bruise, every moment Liam had been told to stay quiet. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up toward his room. I could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing. He was safe now, but safety was not enough. Not after what they had done. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the house. The day was fading, and as the shadows lengthened across the living room floor, I knew with perfect clarity that this was no longer just about removing him from danger. It was about making sure none of them ever had the chance to hurt him again. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a long moment, letting the silence settle before the next storm. The silence in the house felt heavier the next morning. The kind that settles in after a storm, but still carries the echo of thunder. I woke early, checked on Liam, and found him curled against the far side of the bed, holding the same stuffed bear he had ignored for years. His breathing was steady, peaceful, the kind of peace a child should never have had stolen from him in the first place. I let him sleep and stepped downstairs. My phone buzzed before I reached the kitchen. "Daniel, we need to move. They are already trying to get ahead of us." "What did they do now?" I asked. "Filed an emergency motion claiming you are mentally unstable and acted irrationally when you took Liam. Their lawyer submitted it overnight." I felt my jaw tighten. Of course they did. When the truth corners people like them, they throw whatever lies they have left. Daniel continued. "The judge already denied it, but this tells us something important. They are scared. That makes them dangerous." I paced the living room, looking out at the street. The Christmas decorations on the houses around me looked wrong now, like false promises of safety. "What is next?" I asked. "Evidence," Daniel said, "and escalation. We hit them from every angle. Legal, financial, public. Every system they abused to protect themselves, we used to expose them." Before I could answer, I heard small footsteps behind me. Liam stood at the base of the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, can I eat breakfast?" His voice was quiet, but steadier than yesterday. I smiled and told him yes. I made eggs the way he liked them, and watched color slowly come back into his face as he ate. He even asked if he could watch cartoons. I let him. Normalcy mattered today. When he settled on the couch, I stepped into the dining room to take another call from Daniel. He lowered his voice. "Ethan found something else. Janet has been underreporting revenue at her bakery for years. If we file a complaint with the state and IRS, she will face an audit." I leaned against the table. That seemed almost irrelevant compared to what they had done to Liam. But Daniel explained his point. People like the Calders hold power because they look respectable. You take that away, their defense crumbles. Money and reputation, those are their weak spots. Before I could respond, a sharp knock rattled the front door. I froze for a moment until I heard a voice I recognized. "Mark, it is Jack." I opened the door. Jack Monroe stood on the porch, bundled in a jacket, expression grim. "I just came from taking out the trash," he said. "The Calder place is buzzing. Cars pulling in and out. I think they are meeting with their lawyer." I nodded once. Jack stepped closer. "Look, I saw that video. I saw what they did to your boy. If you need anything at all, you call me. I mean that." His voice held a seriousness that came from years in the military and more years dealing with neighbors. I shook his hand. grateful. As he left, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. I opened it and felt my breath catch. A voice recording. 2 adults speaking. A woman laughing lightly. Then a line that made my stomach twist. He needs to toughen up. A little pain will make him stronger. It was Emily, no doubt. A second voice responded. Janet, if he cries, keep him outside. Cold builds character. I sat down slowly, the phone still in my hand. This was not just abuse. This was a philosophy. A family creed built on cruelty. I forwarded the file to Daniel. Within seconds he called. This is big. This proves not just intent, but repeated practice. This is systemic. I asked where he got it. Anonymous? Probably someone in the neighborhood. Maybe someone who heard more than they admitted. I looked toward the couch where Liam sat, watching a cartoon quietly. He did not know that the world was shifting under his feet. That people were coming out of the shadows with truths they had been too afraid to share. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Ethan. Holding a laptop bag and a thermos of coffee he must have known I needed. We need to talk, he said as he stepped inside. He opened his laptop on the dining table. There were charts, call logs, timestamps. This is from the Calder Home Network. Someone in that house has been documenting incidents. Not well, not professionally, but enough to show a pattern. He clicked on a folder. Inside were notes typed under vague labels. December, punishment for attitude. Summer, weakness again, needs correction. One entry made my skin crawl. He cried too long. Melissa says, increased discipline. I closed my eyes, unable to read more. Ethan let the silence settle for a moment. There is another file you need to see, he said. He clicked, and an image appeared. A scan of a handwritten note. It was part of a report Anita had written last year. Emily had asked her to delete it. The note read, child appears fearful when discussing time at grandparents. Avoids naming cousin Luke. Expresses desire not to attend weekend visits. I exhaled slowly. The truth had been right there. They had buried it. And I had let them. Ethan spoke carefully. Daniel wants to use all of this to expand the case. Not just for custody, but for criminal charges. This will become a full investigation. I nodded, my voice low. Good. He closed the laptop. One more thing. Their lawyer is preparing a counterclaim. They are going to argue that you created an unsafe emotional environment. They will try to paint you as unstable at work. I barked a laugh that had no humor in it. They can try. Ethan shrugged. They will lose, but it is going to get loud before it gets quiet. That felt accurate. Liam wandered in then, holding his stuffed bear. He looked at Ethan cautiously, then at me. Dad, is she going to come here? He meant Emily. My chest tightened. Nobody. She cannot come near you, I promise. He nodded, but the fear did not fully leave his eyes. Trauma does not vanish with words. It fades with time and safety repeated enough times to rewrite the brain. Daniel called again in the afternoon. I spoke with the prosecutor. He watched the video. He wants everything, every file, every recording, every email. This is moving fast. I asked how fast. We will likely have detectives interviewing witnesses within 2 days. They want to question every adult in that video, and they will not be gentle. I felt something dark and quiet settle inside me. Not revenge exactly, just justice taking shape. As I hung up, Liam came to my side and leaned against me. Dad, yeah, buddy, I do not want to go back there, ever. I put my hand on top of his. You will not. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. He rested his head against my arm. After a moment, he whispered, Can I sleep in your room tonight? Of course. The day faded into evening, and the house felt warmer than it had in months. I heated soup, sat with Liam while he ate, and watched his shoulders slowly loosen. Safety, even temporary, can do that. As night settled, I tucked him into my bed. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from fear and relief. I stood in the doorway watching him breathe. In that moment, I knew with absolute clarity that every move I made next had to be deliberate, ruthless if needed. Above all, certain. The Calders had hurt the wrong child, and they had underestimated the wrong father. Downstairs, my phone buzzed again. A new email from Daniel. The subject line read, "Next phase." I opened it and saw the first document attached. A formal complaint to the state requesting a full investigation into the Calder family for coordinated child abuse. I sat down slowly, reading every line, feeling the weight of what was coming. It was finally starting, and there was no turning back. The document glowed on my phone screen for a long moment before I finally closed it. The house was quiet except for the soft rhythm of Liam breathing upstairs. I let the quiet settle, steadying myself for what I knew was coming. The next morning began the way mornings usually do after a night of little sleep. Slow, heavy, too bright. I made coffee but barely tasted it. My mind was already in a courtroom, already hearing arguments, already bracing for the lies I knew the Calders would throw like stones. 3 days passed in a blur of meetings with Daniel. Phone calls with investigators, and long conversations with Nancy as she prepared her medical testimony. Liam spent most of that time in the house, watching movies, drawing, or following me from room to room like a shadow. I let him. Whatever he needed. He got. When the morning of the hearing finally arrived, Seattle was covered in a thin layer of frost. The streets glittered like ice dust. I dressed in the same suit I wore at hospital ceremonies, the one that made me feel like I had some control. I helped Liam with his shirt, and he looked at me quietly. "Do I have to talk today?" he asked. "Only if the judge asks you something," I said. "And you do not have to be scared. I will be right there." He nodded, but he kept holding the hem of his sleeve as if bracing himself. Daniel picked us up and rode with us to the courthouse. He kept flipping through his binder, marking pages, preparing his arguments. He only looked up once to say, "You ready?" "Mark, ready does not matter," I said. "Necessary does." The courthouse was buzzing when we arrived. I could hear people whispering before we even stepped inside. News travels fast in a community that pretends to mind its own business but feeds on scandal like oxygen. And our case was no longer quiet. Reporters had picked it up. Photos of the Calder family had circulated online. Public opinion had already turned. Inside the courtroom, the Calders sat in a tight cluster like a pack. Every one of them trying to look composed, but failing to hide the panic under their eyes. Janet looked older than the last time I saw her. Robert had the stiff posture of a man preparing for a fight he could not win. Melissa glared at me with hatred that barely looked human. Hunter paced behind them. Derek sat stiffly, avoiding cameras. Emily sat in the front row with her lawyer, hair perfectly arranged, tears already threatening to fall. None of it moved me. I had seen the real version of all of them. The bailiff called the session to order. They brought us forward. Daniel motioned for me to take the seat next to him. Liam stayed behind with a child advocate until called. Judge Brooks entered with the seriousness of someone who understood exactly what kind of case everyone was watching. She looked at us, then at the Calders. Her face did not soften. "Let us begin." Daniel rose first. He laid out our evidence like a surgeon exposing a wound. He described the video. He described the injuries. He described the emails, the deleted notes, the financial concealment, the CPS interference. He presented everything in calm, measured detail. When he finished, he stepped aside without dramatics. Then it was the Calder lawyer's turn. Their attorney, a tall man with a polished voice, approached the bench with a smile practiced for juries and donors. "Your Honor, my clients are pillars of their community. This is a case of a father acting irrationally and exaggerating a minor disciplinary situation into a claim of abuse. He accused me of manipulating the system. He accused Daniel of orchestrating a spectacle. Then he looked at me as if expecting me to break. I did not, he continued. The father is a surgeon with a high-stress job. His judgment may be affected. We believe a psychological evaluation is warranted. Daniel shot up. Judge Brooks had already raised her hand. Denied. She said the word with enough force that the lawyer stopped mid-breath. Now we will address the evidence. They called Nancy first. She swore in and walked to the stand with a stillness that carried weight. Her testimony was clinical, precise, devastating. She described each bruise, its age, its pattern, its cause. She stated clearly this was not accidental trauma. This was inflicted. The Calder lawyer tried to challenge her. Dr. Children fall often, do they not? She did not blink. Children do not fall in patterns that match adult fingerprints. Children do not fall in ways that produce symmetrical bruising on both arms. Children do not fall in ways that reproduce the same injury at different stages of healing. He tried again. Are you implying my client systematically abused Liam? She looked him in the eye. No, I am not implying it. I am stating it, the courtroom murmured. The Calder lawyer stopped questioning. Next came Anita. She was nervous at first, but her voice steadied as she recounted how Emily pressured her to close the file. How notes disappeared, how red flags were minimized. It painted a picture of manipulation that even the Calder lawyer struggled to counter. Then the judge called for Liam. My breath caught. He walked in slowly, holding a small toy car the advocate had given him. He looked so small in that giant room. I stood when he passed by, just so he would know I was there. He sat in the chair, and the judge smiled gently. Liam, do you know why you are here? She asked. He nodded. Can you tell me what happened at your grandparents' house on December 23rd? His voice was small. They hit me. The Calder lawyer stood. Liam, are you sure you understand what happened? Sometimes children get confused or scared when things get loud. Liam looked at him, then at me, then at the judge. They hit me. All of them. I tried not to cry. Mom said crying made me weak. A sound rose behind me. Emily covered her mouth and shook her head like she could deny a truth spoken by her own child. The lawyer pressed on. Did your father ever tell you what to say today? Liam frowned, confused. No. He told me to tell the truth. Judge Brooks lifted her hand again. Enough. She turned to Liam and spoke softly. Thank you. You may go sit with the advocate. He walked back and sat. When our eyes met, he gave a tiny nod. Brave, honest. Then it was my turn. I took the stand. The room felt hot under the lights. I spoke slowly, carefully. I told the judge about the subtle changes in my son. The fear, the quiet hurt that built over months. I told her about the video and how it felt watching someone I once trusted strike my child. I told her how I had failed to see the signs sooner. My voice wavered when I said that part. But I kept speaking. I did not talk about revenge. I talked about protection, safety, fatherhood. The Calder lawyer tried to shake me. Do you deny having anger issues due to your job? I said no. Do you deny that your work schedule makes you an inconsistent parent? I said no. Do you deny that your wife was the primary caregiver? I said no. Then why would she harm the child she cared for? He said triumphantly. I looked straight at him. I do not know. But she did. Daniel stood. Your Honor, we would like to play the audio recording entered into evidence. The judge nodded. The courtroom quieted. Ethan pressed a button on his tablet. The voices echoed through the speakers. He needs to toughen up. A little pain will make him stronger. Cold builds character. I watched the faces of the Calder family stiffen. Emily shut her eyes hard, and her shoulders curled inward like the words themselves struck her. For once, the lawyer had nothing to say. When the recording ended, Judge Brooks leaned back in her chair. She was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. "This court has heard enough." Every breath in the room stilled. "The evidence presented shows clear and repeated abuse by multiple adults in the Calder family. It shows deliberate concealment by the mother. It shows the father acted to protect his child once he became aware. Therefore, I am granting full legal and physical custody to the father, Mark Turner. Effective immediately." Emily let out a broken sound. Part gasp, part sob. The judge continued. "Emily Turner is restricted to supervised visitation only. The Calder family is barred from contact with Liam for 24 months pending further review. In addition, I am forwarding the case file to the county prosecutor for review of potential criminal charges." A wave of voices erupted behind us. The bailiff shouted for order. Janet cried out. Robert cursed. Melissa shouted my name. But all I saw was Liam. He was looking at me with wide eyes, unsure if he was allowed to smile or if the world was safe enough yet. I walked to him. He stood and wrapped his arms around my waist. His voice was small, but full of relief. "Dad, can we go home?" "Yes, buddy, we can go home." We stepped out of the courtroom into cold air and afternoon sun. Reporters swarmed the entrance, but Daniel shielded us and guided us toward the car. Liam gripped my hand tightly, as if someone might still try to take him. As we pulled onto the street, I looked back once and saw the Calders on the courthouse steps arguing with each other. The United Front gone. The cracks were finally showing. Daniel exhaled beside me. "This part is over." I knew what he meant. The custody battle was done. But the fight for accountability was only beginning, and I was ready for it. Liam leaned against me in the back seat as we drove away from the courthouse. His small hand wrapped around my wrist, like he still needed proof that none of them could pull him away again. I kept my arm around him until his breathing steadied. The December sun was low, pale against the Seattle skyline. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe without that crushing weight in my chest. Life did not snap back to normal after that. It never does. But something changed that day. Something settled. Something ended. The next few weeks moved slowly. Some days felt peaceful. Some days felt like aftershocks. Liam would wake up in the middle of the night crying quietly, and I would sit beside him until he fell asleep again. Other nights, he crawled into my room without a word, and I let him stay. I reduced my hours at the hospital and took a consulting schedule so I could be home for him. Those first months were about healing, not routine. We started therapy together. A soft-spoken therapist named Dr. Moss helped Liam unpack what had happened to him in ways I could not. Sometimes I sat in the waiting room while he talked alone. Sometimes I sat beside him while he drew pictures or talked about the nights at the Calder house. The sessions were not easy, but he kept showing up. That was enough. Around February, the prosecutor's office contacted Daniel. A detective wanted to go over the files one more time. They had everything. The video, the medical reports, the emails, the audio recording, witness statements, CPS logs. The case was strong. Criminal charges were filed a month later. 7 defendants, assault of a minor, child endangerment, failure to report abuse, conspiracy. It hit the local news within hours. That shook the Calders harder than anything else. I watched from a distance as their world cracked. Janet's bakery closed for repairs that never seemed to end. Then it shut down permanently when the audit findings leaked. Robert stepped down from every board he served on. Melissa's perfect parenting blog vanished overnight. Derek lost 3 listings after clients requested a different agent. Hunter was fired after a workplace review uncovered conduct issues. Sophie tried to apologize once in a voicemail, but I could not listen to the whole thing. Emily lost her job first. King County Family Services suspended her license pending investigation. When more evidence surfaced, they revoked it. The details came in a short email I read twice out of disbelief. She worked temporary retail jobs after that. Nothing steady, nothing that involved children. She asked to see Liam once during that time. Supervised visitation was approved. I left the decision to him. He thought about it for 2 days, then quietly said no. I respected that. Every few weeks I received updates from Daniel and Ethan. They told me the Calders had stopped coordinating their defense. Internal fractures, arguments, blame. When people like that lose power, they lose unity. By the time the criminal trial began in May, their lawyer had withdrawn and they were represented by a new firm that looked exhausted before the first hearing even started. The trial itself took 2 weeks. I testified again. So did Nancy and Anita. So did Jack. The video was played in full. The courtroom felt cold each time Liam's small body jolted from a slap or when someone laughed lightly near the end of the footage. I watched Emily during that moment. She did not cry. She did not look away. She looked at the floor like she knew the person on the screen was not the woman she wished she had been. The sentences varied. Robert received jail time. Janet, community service and mandatory counseling. Melissa, a fine and probation. Derek, suspension of his license. Hunter, community service. Sophie, counseling required by the court. Emily, 3 years probation with conditions she would never meet. None of it felt like enough. But it was something. And it was official. They were no longer people who could hide behind respectability. Summer came. Seattle warmed. Liam started smiling more. Real smiles. Not the guarded ones he used at school before. He started building a new treehouse in the backyard and insisted I help. It became our project. He asked me questions about tools and measurements. I watched him rediscover curiosity. That thing fear had tried to crush out of him. One evening in early fall, we were sitting in that new treehouse. He was 10 by then. Taller, stronger, still quiet but no longer shrinking from shadows. He looked at me with an expression older than his age. Dad, do you think I will ever have to see them again? Not unless you want to when you are older, I said. I do not think I want to. Then you do not have to, he nodded. He looked out across the yard for a long time before speaking again. When she hit me that day, I thought maybe I really was weak. Maybe something was wrong with me. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Nothing was wrong with you. They were wrong. Every single one of them. He looked at me again, searching my face like he wanted to make sure he could trust the answer. I believe that now. Not because of them, because you came home. I pulled him into a hug. The simple truth of his voice cut through something inside me. All the guilt I carried, all the anger, all the regret. It did not disappear. But it softened. Because he was right. I came home when he needed me. I did what I should have done from the start. I did not let fear or doubt or denial stop me again. We walked back inside as the sun dropped behind the cedar trees. I cooked dinner while he set the table. The house felt like a home again. Not perfect, not unscarred, but real. Safe. Hours later that night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. I wrote down everything I wished I had understood earlier. Every sign I had missed. Every instinct I should have listened to. I did not write it for guilt. I wrote it because I wanted something to remember. Something Liam could read one day when he was ready. If you ever find yourself afraid. I wrote, tell someone. If someone hurts you, it is never your fault. And if you ever doubt your worth, know that you were loved even when I did not know how to protect you the way I should have. I closed the notebook and looked around the quiet kitchen. It felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Healing is not a quick process, but it had started. Now and then I still heard scraps of news about the Calder family. People avoiding them at the grocery store. Houses sold quietly. Jobs lost. Friendships dissolved. Consequences that had been waiting years finally catching up. I did not take pleasure in it, but I did feel closure. The truth had finally reached the light. And once truth arrives, it does not leave. A year after everything happened, on the anniversary of that December day, Liam asked if we could go hiking. He said he wanted to be somewhere high up, where the air felt different. We drove north to a trail near Mount Baker. The sky was clear and cold. We climbed until we reached an overlook. He stood beside me, staring at the valley below, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed. "I am not scared anymore," he said. "I know, buddy." He smiled at me, a real one, the kind he had not shown in a long time. "Thanks for coming back for me." I felt my throat tighten. There are moments in life that anchor you. That was one of them. We stood there a little longer before heading down. When we reached the car, he asked if he could pick the music for the drive home. I told him yes, and he played some upbeat song I barely recognized, but let run anyway. Life had moved forward, and so had we. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to our story. These things happen in real homes, behind closed doors. And the only way they stop is when someone finally speaks, finally sees, finally acts. If this story made you feel anything, share your thoughts, share your experiences, and stay connected. Sometimes a single voice telling the truth is enough to change everything.